Welcome to Greg's Maker Corner. In this video, I'm going to be talking about some tips and tricks for running your Voron 0.1 and also just some general maintenance things that you may want to do and consider just to keep your Voron running in tip-top condition. You're going to need a few supplies. I use a Super Lube multi-synthetic use oil, or if you're more into grease, you might want that. I also would recommend a Shimmy bin. I'll give the link in the description. And then some IPA for just cleaning your bed, and a piece of paper for leveling your bed. So we're going to cover that and a little more, so stay tuned. And as always, if you enjoy this video and get something out of it, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks a lot. All right, I'd like to cover how I level the bed. The Voron 0.1 uses a manual bed leveling system, which you probably already knew, but I'll describe it real briefly. So there are some springs here. There's 3 of them, which creates a 3-point plane, and you're going to typically have a pretty thick bed, about maybe 6 millimeters of aluminum, and then you're going to have some screws and some springs that are held in tension that keep the bed flat and level. This is, given that it's such a small area, a manual solution is fine, although there are some people and there are some mods that exist for doing auto leveling, but I really think that's overkill, especially since this is such a thick bed in a small area. The very first thing you're going to need to do when you're leveling your bed is you're going to want to preheat your Voron. Typically, I will preheat it to whatever filament that I'm using the most. And as I go through these steps, I'm going to be using Mainsail as my UI, but these will all apply to Fluid as well as Octoprint if you're using those for your front end. All right, in order to preheat the bed, I recommend defining a preset. You can see that I've got several here. Unlike a lot of the settings, you're going to need to go into the, instead of the printer config, you're going to need to go under the interface tab. And here on the right, you're going to see this preheat presets. So you can add a preset, and I've went ahead and added a profile for ABS, PETG, PLA, and TPU. It's very easy to add one. You just press add, type in the temps for both extruder and heated bed, and then you can even define custom Gcode that'll run, whenever you want to run that preset. So I went ahead and I'll go ahead and pick. I print a lot of ABS, so I'm going to go ahead and pick that. One of the really nice things about Clipper is that you can set up macros, and then you can click those macros on the, on the front end. So I've created one called Level Bed, and I really just have 2 Gcodes there. One is G28, which will home all the axes, and the other one is this Bed Screws Adjust. In order to use the Bed Screws Adjust command, which is native to Clipper, you also need this Bed Screws section, and this simply defines where the screws are underneath your bed, so it knows where to go to stop so you can adjust your screws. So now that my printer is about preheated, I'm going to go ahead and simply click this Level Bed Gcode macro. When I click that, it's going to run it's going to run the Level Bed command, but it's actually running that Gcode that I put in, which will home the printer, and then it'll begin doing the Clipper built-in functionality for adjustment, which you can see just popped up here. So the first screw that I'm going to be adjusting for is the very front one. And all I'm going to do is take a thin sheet of paper, and I'm going to slide it under there, and then I'm just simply going to drag it. Now in this case, you can kind of hear the drag there. You can see it's not a real heavy drag, and the drag is also not putting any filament on the paper. Now you can do this with filament loaded. I currently do not have any filament loaded. If you do have filament loaded though, you want to retract a little bit so you're not getting leakage. So in this case, I'm pretty happy with the amount of drag I have here. It's just enough, right? And you kind of get a feel for this. If it's too loose and there's no drag, then you're going to want to turn your screw to the right. If it's too tight, then you're going to want to turn your screw a little bit to the left. And I'd recommend no more than about 1/8 of a turn at a time. So now that I'm back at my console, I can go in here and I want to type in accept, since I didn't have to change anything. So I went ahead and typed that in, and I'm going to hit send. Now the printer has moved the head back to the back left, which is the next screw. Now that feels like it's just a tiny bit too tight, so I'm going to put my hand underneath and I'm going to do a slight turn to the left. And after doing that, yeah, it's about right. So I'm going to come back to the console and I'm simply going to type adjust because I adjusted it, or I'm sorry, adjusted. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit send. So now that I did that, it's going to move to the next screw. So the adjusted command will still move it forward, but it's going to make me do it again because when you adjust things, you can potentially move other things out of whack. Now in this case, I'm really happy with the amount of drag I have here. So I'm going to go back to the console and type accept. So I'm back here at the console. I'm going to type accept. And then now it's going to repeat the process since I had to do one adjustment. All right, I was happy with how everything worked. So then I accepted all three of the all three of the settings when I tested it at each point. So you can see here 3 accepts. And then now it says bed screws tool completed successfully. So now I'm all good to go. So if I wanted to do this manually, I would go ahead and hit home all. And what that's going to do is that it's simply going to go through a homing process, as you can see here. Now one thing that you'll notice is the head's pretty high. That's because of the safe homing distance that I have set. So now I manually have to lower my Z-axis by 20 because I have a setting in my printer config that does a Z-hop for 20. So I'm going to go ahead and click this 20 times. And it's just going to manually lower the head. So now once it's at 0, I can do my paper leveling. Okay, so here's what the head looks like once you lower the Z. And it feels pretty good. It's about what I would expect. Now, what I'll do as well is instead, if I don't want to use my Gcode, I can move the Y up, I can move it, move the X over, and just do it, again, just do it manually with jogging the controls. So for example, I could do X -20, I'll just click it twice, and then I could do Y, if I want to bring it closer to home, I can do -10, -20, -30, -40, and you can kind of keep an eye on the coordinates up here. So I can check that at about, let's go 10, 10. Okay, so you can see I manually jogged the controls over here. And you would just repeat this pretty much across the board for every point that you want to check. Now, since I don't actually have a screw here, that's probably not that helpful, right? But you can see, how are we doing on drag and how's everything working out. So you can check it anywhere, really, when you go manual. Okay, you can see here that my bed is getting kind of a little gooey, greasy looking. There's a lot of glue stick that I have on here. I've been doing a lot of TPU lately. So one of the reasons that I use glue stick is because I don't want it to stick to the plate too strong and rip my plate. So glue stick can be a nice release agent. I just use this simple PVA. It's a purple glue stick and it seems to work pretty well. On the other side of the sheet, I actually have a Textured PEI and it's looking pretty good. Textured PEI doesn't really need a release agent, so you can just print directly on that. But sometimes, I want a flat texture even when printing TPU, so I'll use this side. So all I'm going to do to clean off my plate is just put a drop of dish soap on there, and then I'm going to just give it a good wash. You can see here, just rinsing some water over it. Sometimes that glue will get a little sticky and you'll need to wipe it with a paper towel as well. And on the back side, you can do the same thing. Just give it a good rinse with some dish soap. And when you're done washing it off, just make sure there's no filament kind of in there. I think I got most of mine off. And then just make sure you dry it real well. You don't want any water sitting around on these because they can and will rust if you're not careful. But it almost looks as good as new. And when you're in between prints, I use this isopropyl alcohol. This is 99.9% pure. But you can use 91, 90, and you're fine. But I'll just usually put a squirt or two on there. And then I will take my paper towel and just kind of wipe it off. And be careful not to get your fingerprints on there because your fingers will leave an oily residue behind. And even the IPA, it'll help, but it'll just end up spreading it around. Depending on how often you print, maybe about every week or two, I recommend checking your rails and just looking at them to see if, is everything still running smoothly? Are there any rough spots? And just doing some maintenance on them. A can of compressed air can be helpful for this step because we also want to spray out any plastic that may have gotten into the cracks. And before you do anything with the rails, or when you're going to be manually moving things around, and spraying things or greasing, I recommend, of course, turning off the printer. So you can see there's maybe a little bit of just dust and, I don't know, stuff over there. So I'm just going to take my can of compressed air, just give it a good spray all around. You can see there's all kinds of particles and dust and junk that just kind of blew around. You don't have to get too carried away with this, but it certainly doesn't hurt spraying stuff out. Because of where the Voron 0 homes, which is in the back here, you also want to make sure there's no filament that's just kind of hanging around in this spot. So a lot of times I'll just go back there and spray, or I'll get my tweezers out and pull out any pieces that are just sitting there. Another useful tool is just a Q-tip, and you can just come alongside here and just kind of remove anything that's sitting on the rail, and then do it on the top rail too. Something that I've noticed with mine is that sometimes I feel and hear a chunkiness, and what can happen is this rail can sometimes get pressed a little too tight against the extrusion. So I've actually found myself having to loosen these screws a little bit, just so it doesn't kind of grind as much. You don't want to loosen them much, but you might want to just adjust them a little bit. But make sure that everything's running smoothly. The other thing that can happen is this can, it can be off-centered a little bit. Maybe it wasn't on quite right in the first place. And then that can cause issues with, just freedom of movement, which will eventually show up as artifacts in your prints. So mine are running really smoothly, which is a good thing, but I do want to put a little bit of oil on mine. All right, so the oils and synthetics that I use here are either a grease or an oil. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. Oil, typically you're going to have to do it more often, but it's going to allow you to move really quick and not have to worry about grease kind of sticking around. But the lube, or the grease here, is going to give you a little bit more protection, especially on the rails, and you won't have to do it as frequently. So some climates, you may have a lot of humidity. I've actually had rust get on my rails before, not on the Voron, but on another machine, and that's not fun to deal with, especially if you're not keeping things lubed up enough. One thing that I'll note on these lubes and oils, there's a lot of different advice and thoughts on what the appropriate oil and lube is to use. Some people will use like a 3-in-1 oil. Some people will use the Mobile oil. Some folks will use the Mobile Lux EP2 or EP3 oil. I encourage you to do research, but I have been using this oil for a long time, probably for more than 5 or 6 years on different printers. Never had any issues. This is one of my workhorse printers, and this has thousands of hours of printing on it, has rails. I've been using the oil periodically and the lube on this printer and had no issues at all. So what I'm going to use here is this oil, and I'm simply going to come in and just do a real light greasing of it. And then I'll do the same thing here. And then I'll do the same thing on the back, along the back side, and then also on the top part of these rails, because that's where the carriages are going to get in there. And you don't want to do too much, so that was a little bit too big of a line. But after you're done, you're simply going to just wipe it off. Okay, so something I just noticed is that my rail was actually sounding a little rough on the right-hand side here. So I loosened these 2 screws, and now they're nice and smooth. And what the issue was is the rail was a little off-center. So hear that grinding? That's not good. So you want to loosen a couple screws, just kind of move it over and see how that grinding's gone. And then after you do that, just tighten it down. Okay, so I did a little adjustment. Now you can hear everything is nice and clean. And similarly here, if any of these rails get out of whack a little bit, you might hear grinding, so just feel free to adjust them until they sound right. I like to go by sound. I think it's easier to adjust it that way. Even the tool that you get to center the rails, it's not perfect. And every machine, has a little bit of difference. So you may be slightly out of square and need to do that. But generally speaking, your rail should look very centered once you're done adjusting it. All right, well, we still got our lube out. It's a good idea to lower your plate all the way to the bottom. And then you want to go ahead and put a little bit of lube on your lead screw just to keep it moving smoothly. And you might as well get these back rails as well for the Z with either your lube or your oil. So for the lube, I'm just gonna put a little tiny bit, just kind of right there, like that. And then I'm gonna take my finger and just kind of gunk it up a little bit. Now you don't want a ton on there, right? But a good spot is kind of right here in the middle. And it's gonna catch that when it comes back up. And then I recommend doing this while it's turned off and manually, so just kind of twist it with your hand. And then also, just like we were checking the X and the Y, just make sure there aren't any rough spots when you're coming up and down. And I'll go ahead and put a little bit of oil just in these slots as well, on both sides. Just a real gentle bit. And you want to do the inside and the outside. And sometimes it can be a little hard. You might even need to take off the panels on the sides to get a little better access to it. If you haven't used Loctite on your tool head or in your frame, it's also a really good idea to check pretty much all the screws that are visible and that are certainly the ones that are experiencing vibration or movement, which is pretty much all of them. So if you see that a lot of them are loose, especially on the tool head or maybe on some of the rail parts, you might want to consider using basically a thread locker. I see a lot of people in the Discord asking about the Z axis and the screw, so I just want to show where my screw position is. Now you might want to go lower than that to get the full travel out of the Z, but that's about where I have mine. So you certainly don't want it loose at all. You want it kind of as deep and tight in there as you can. You also want it to be able to hit this little button on the end stop. So there's a tiny little button. It's really hard to see. You can barely make it out there. But that little white button is what it's going to hit, and that's what's going to trigger the Z. So I recommend manually moving the lead screw, turning it to the left or clockwise. Or I'm sorry, to the right. Turning it clockwise to the right when you're first building, and then you're going to hit it, and you want to make sure that your nozzle is not going to run into the bed. So if your nozzle's hitting the bed, mine's above it, so it's not an issue, and I've already leveled mine. You're going to have problems though, and your nozzle will dig into your bed. So that's just a tip on getting your adjustment screw properly set. And here's how the Y-axis is set up. You can see that there's a end stop with the metal piece still on it. So when you move it, you should be able to hear it click. If you can't hear it click, you're going to have problems. So in my case, you also want to check for racking. So push your gantry all the way back, and both sides should be touching. If you have any kind of racking there, meaning one side, maybe there's an air gap, that means that your belts need to be retensioned. All right, next up I'm going to show how I load filament. And first I'm going to talk about TPU, which you may not be printing a lot of, but if you are, you'll notice that it's very soft and flexible. And what I have found is that feeding it through the PFTE tube here is not always a great idea for feeding, and sometimes you'll have issues. So with that in mind, I typically will remove the PFTE tube from the head, and then I will manually load the filament just like this, and I'll leave the top hat off, and then I'll just kind of print with it. I might even rotate the roll so it's like that and can feed easier. And this is Overture TPU. It's really heavy. It's actually a full kilogram of TPU, which is a lot. So that's what I recommend in terms of loading with TPU. For all other filaments, there's no issue using the PFTE tube. And in this case, I've got some ABS here, and I'm just going to kind of get it started here in the PFTE, and then I'm going to feed it by hand. And then I'm eventually going to be able to see the filament coming through the tube. Hopefully you can see that on the camera there. Okay, I still have my tube off, but I just wanted to show that coming out. So normally I'll have this in, and then what I'll do is I'll just feed it in until there's a little bit of tension. Got to make sure that you can't you can't push it anymore. So for tension on ABS, I want to go all the way to where I can't turn it anymore, and then maybe back it off about half a turn or so. That's where I typically run my filament. For PLA, just leave it all the way tight. For TPU, I actually found that going about two full turns, almost a good 1.5 to 2 turns, depending on how soft the filament is. And before I load the filament, I'm going to go into Clipper, and then I'm going to preheat and pick ABS. And then I'm just going to wait for it to get to temp. So we're close enough. Once you get above 200 C or around there, you can hit the load filament button. So I'm going to click that. Okay, here you can see that I hit the load filament button and the filament is coming out. And that's pretty much what you'd expect load filament sections look like. And unload's going to be very similar. You're just going to click the unload button and it's going to run the Gcode. It'll purge the filament and then it'll retract it. So it'll purge about 10 millimeters and retract about 60, which is really all you need. And then you can simply pull the spool out. So I'll go ahead and hit that unload filament. You can see kind of what's going on here. It purged it a little bit. And you really can't hear it too well. It's pretty quiet. And then you can simply pull it out. So if it's still a little tight, you need to increase your retraction distance. Make sure that when you do this, I'm doing it with one hand right now, but you want to make sure you keep tension on your spool. And in some cases, I just like to manually load, so it's a very similar process. You're going to preheat your hot end. After preheating, I'm just going to use the extrude button. And I'm going to go ahead and typically do it, pick maybe 10 and 5, and then I'm going to hit it a couple times, maybe 3 or 4 times. And as you can see here, we got a nice little extrude once again. One of the things I like about the Shimmy bin is that it's great for little pieces of plastic, especially when I'm changing nozzles. It keeps the plastic bits down, so I encourage everybody to print one of those. I just come in here and grab that and drop it in, and I'm off to the races. Something else that I recommend checking is the fans. So these 3010 fans, and even of course the hot end fan as well, but these tend to, I've noticed they kind of crap out, so it's good to have some extras that are spares, but make sure that they're spinning. And the best way to make sure that they're spinning is to come in here in the clipper and just kick it all the way up to 100. And then you can just check and make sure that things are spinning okay. And if you see if you see where it's not, in my case they both are, you may want to consider getting some different fans and checking your wiring, making sure there's no kinks or shorts. You can also check it at different speeds. All right, I hope I've given you some helpful information on how I maintain and run my printer. There certainly are a lot of other ground that we could cover in terms of tips and tricks and maintenance, but I thought this would be a good starting point. If there are particular things that you're looking to learn about or understand more, and you think that it would be good for my channel, please leave a comment, and that's something that I'll consider for future video content. And again, thanks for watching, and if you found this helpful, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks a lot.